a 28-point peace plan to end the war in Ukraine. Vice President J.D. Vance called Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to tell him that he had a choice, either to accept the plan or no longer have American military aid. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world. Each week I sit down with leading journalists and experts to break down what's happening in the world, why it matters, and what comes next. This week, a look at what's happening in Ukraine with Susan Glasser, who's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she writes the weekly Letter from Trump's Washington column. James Harding, who's the editor-in-chief of The Observer, and Peter Spiegel, the managing editor of The Washington Post. We're recording this on Friday, November 21st. Susan Glasser of The New Yorker. Every day is a surprise, but when it comes to foreign policy, today is a big surprise. Let me start with you. A short while ago, President Zelensky of Ukraine told his people that Ukraine was facing what he said, quote, a very difficult choice between losing our dignity or risk losing our key partner, referring to the United States. Apparently, this came after President Zelensky had a phone call with Vice President J.D. Vance, in which he said, this plan that we have concocted with the Russians is one that we want you to sign up to by Thanksgiving, which of course is next Thursday. Help us understand what happened and how did we get to this point, the same day that the sanctions on Russia were supposed to be implemented by the United States?
Yeah, I mean, Ivo, it is, of course, a tragedy, but I'm going to dissent on the idea that it's a surprise. In many ways, I think we have been, zigging and zagging and hurtling our way to this moment ever since Donald Trump, with J.D. Vance as his running mate, was reelected to be the president of the United States. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance never supported Ukraine after the full-scale Russian invasion in 2022. Familiar history here, but worth noting that not only did Trump call it an act of strategic genius on the part of Vladimir Putin on the eve of the invasion, but both Trump and Vance were specifically against the billions of dollars in assistance that the United States Congress on a bipartisan basis voted repeatedly to send to Ukraine with the Biden administration. In that context, in the campaign, they were actually quite clear in the run-up to 2024 that they were not only going to seek a solution, but would be willing to do so on Russian terms that required Ukraine to concede land for peace. And so that was the contours in which we got to January 20th of this year. In fact, Donald Trump said he would settle the war in 24 hours. That would have only been possible under a circumstance of pressuring Ukraine to accept a deal like the very one that here we are 9 months later and is now being advanced on them. This is the same Trump who hosted Zelensky in the Oval Office and berated him for all the world to see, and greeted Vladimir Putin on a red carpet at a U.S. military base in August. So, I say that because I understand that in diplomacy, one has to work the angles, even if they aren't really evident what the opening is. And Donald Trump at various times has also given the sense of openings and the possibility that he was frustrated with Vladimir Putin for not agreeing earlier to the terms. He has at various points advanced the idea that he might support Ukraine with even more advanced weaponry, though he hasn't really done so. He allowed his administration to work on the provision of weapons from Europe that would be supplied by the United States but paid for by Europe. So, again, I don't want to, fully say that there weren't overtures to Ukraine in this period, but we all know that when you are talking about someone who's pushing age 80 with as definitive opinions as Donald Trump has, they are unlikely to change. And his core, view of Ukraine and of Russia has been set long ago. And we know which side he's on, I think.
But Susan, can I just ask you, because I agree with everything you said. This has been the direction of travel since the campaign started. However, as you always said, there always seems to be particularly the Trump whisperers from Europe show up. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, Alex Stubb, the president of Finland, shows up. And usually within 24, 48, 72 hours, he's backtracked. I'm just curious why you think this time is somewhat different than what we've seen previously.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Peter, I don't consider them Trump whisperers. I consider them to be Trump placaters, and their job and their strategy as they adopted it. And I understand that. By the way, it's a rational choice, if not necessarily the only choice. But their strategy that they chose was to maximally flatter Donald Trump, to treat him in effect like a very dangerous animal, to try to, put a cage around him and to say like, okay, sir, we're not going to upset you or alienate you. In return, let's propose something different. I think that what people have perceived to be zigs and zags of Donald Trump are the zigs and zags that are inherent in how Donald Trump negotiates things. And, remember, I think that what's been mistaken here is the idea that Donald Trump had a core view of this conflict and that it's been changed by this. I would say the change is that Donald Trump has chosen to insert himself and therefore his prestige and credibility in the idea of a settlement. And so what we're seeing is how Donald Trump, frankly, talks in almost any situation when he's trying to get people to come to a deal. This is very consistent with how he behaves in a tariff negotiation, how he behaved in the Middle East, how he behaved with North Korea's leader in his first term. Does it mean that Donald Trump no longer has a core view of tariffs when he, suddenly backs down or backtracks? No, of course it doesn't. And I think what people lost, and there's a lot of spinning here. And again, I do understand, the existential terms for Ukraine or for Europe that may have led them to give an overly optimistic or incorrect gloss on their dealings with Donald Trump. But for those of us who've been watching this for the last 10 years, there's just no way, I don't think, that you conclude anything other than that Donald Trump has a consistent predilection in favor of Russia, that he actually believes that Ukraine is basically not a real country. And let's remember that even before this invasion, in his first term, he hosted the then president of Ukraine, Petro Poroshenko, in his office at the White House. And he told the president of Ukraine to his face, it's not a real country. And his source for this information was people at Mar-a-Lago who told him that lots of people speak Russian there. Okay? So again, I get the confusion inherent in the zigging and zagging, but that's my interpretation for what it's.
So, Peter and James, I want to come to you in a minute, but Peter, just help us a little understand what it is that is now on offer, quote unquote. And I think that's but what it's a 28-point plan. Some people are even saying that it's badly translated from the Russian. And key points, which is kind of interesting. But it's a 28-point plan drawn up by the peace envoy, über alles, Steve Witkoff, who seems to be Trump's go-to man when it comes to difficult negotiations. What's in the plan, and why is this such a problem?
Well, drawn up by Witkoff with a Russian input. I mean, it literally done, and this has been the Russian talking point since the beginning, right? I mean, the highlights are, basically, you give up Donbass, which is the eastern Ukrainian territory they've been fighting over for multiple years.
11 years since the beginning of the conflict in 2014, right?
100%. They would have to take limits on the size of the military in Ukraine. There would be no foreign troops allowed on Ukrainian soil. I mean, basic sovereign things that Putin has been demanding since day one. And they seem to have taken the entire thing hook, line, and sinker. And that's the slightly, I mean, again, I don't disagree with Susan. The thing I can't quite get my head around slightly is that there were negotiations going around that narrowed the gap between the Ukrainians and the Russians over, and again, it was not in the realm of any agreement, but there was some narrowing of the parameters. This has now gone completely the other direction. It's basically back to square one, things that Putin has been demanding since the start, which is, again, makes you wonder. There's been a lot of discussion, and frankly, I don't think the reporting is right yet. Was Witkoff freelancing on this? Is Trump 100% behind this? I mean, I think the argument is that Witkoff doesn't do anything that he knows Trump wants. So I think that some of that reporting, or at least that speculation, may be wrong. But to me, it's so out of left field, which is why I was asking Susan the question about why this time it's so much worse than before. I will venture a guess that within 24, 48 hours, we're likely to see a ratcheting back over this, particularly since you're going to get a lot of Republicans on the Hill, Lindsey Graham and some others, who are going to push back on this, who've always been strong supporters of Ukraine. So I'm not quite as depressed as Susan is on this. I do think there's going to be an opportunity to scale back. The one thing I will say, and I think James is probably more an expert than me on this than I am, this has been something, as Susan said, that's been coming for well over a year now. And the Europeans have known this, and the Europeans have been talking about this, Trump-proofing their national security. Their inability to develop a domestic armaments industry that could supply the Ukrainians separate from the United States is somewhat shocking. They've been talking about this for years, since Trump won. Their inability to actually act on it, and I think it's a real condemnation to the EU, but also, frankly, the Europeans writ large. And I'm just curious if you have a thought on that, because, the UK has been, in many ways, the leading hawk on Russia-Ukraine. And yet, no one has been able to provide a defense industry that's able to. They said these targets for shell production that they were to give the Ukrainians. All of them have been missed. They're hugely reliant for all long-term missiles on American defense companies. There seems to have been no movement, despite 10 years of war, for the Europeans to get their act together on developing a domestic defense industry that could help supply the Ukrainians if the Americans, as was predicted, end up ducking out.
So, James, this is a great time to bring you in, both on the issues that Peter raises, which is why isn't it that Europe has been able to Trump-proof itself, even though that has been its declared aim. But I would go further. Why is it that Europe has been once again caught off guard? They seem to have been completely caught off guard by this. When I was talking to European diplomats, and I'm sure you have as well, they didn't see this one coming. And they think it's a terrible idea. There's now the second phone call, I guess, with the three European leaders with Zelensky after the Vance phone call this morning was another one. When you talk to folks over in London and others, when your reporters are out there in the field, what are they hearing from the Europeans? How are they interpreting what the president is trying to do, and what is the way forward?
So let me deal with the European response first, but there are a couple of other things I'd love to say, Eva. On the European response, the call between Merz, Starmer and Macron, what's really interesting is that tonally, they've hit something very tepid, quite placatory, and that signals two things. One is, you're right, they didn't see it coming, right? So they don't know what to say yet, right? But the other thing is, I think that much more so than anything that's gone before, the Europeans won't wear this. And they're trying to work out tactically how best to approach Trump, because they now know what they're dealing with. And a straight confrontation won't necessarily work, but playing for time often does. And I suppose when I step back from this, I think there are two things, and I don't know what to think of it. Either this is the end of Steve Witkoff, or it's the end of the West. And the odd thing is, one seems very flimsy and silly, and the other one is as sort of profound as anything that's happened in a fair few decades. Silly and flimsy because Steve Witkoff, let's remember, is the architect of the triumphant Alaska summit. Here is the person who brought President Putin to meet President Trump down a red carpet, rewarding him for nothing on a complete misunderstanding of a meeting that he had had in Moscow. So on the one hand, we shouldn't be totally surprised if Steve Witkoff has meetings with Kirill Dmitriev in Florida, buys the story hook, line and sinker, and then sells it as a quote-unquote plan, right? It's not necessarily a plan. It's Steve Witkoff's idea of how he can somehow, land this one, and he probably won't. And he might well end up being enormously discredited by it, and that might be the direction this thing goes, for exactly the reason Peter says, not just on the Hill, but European capitals too. But it is possible, and here's my end of the West argument, it is possible that what you're seeing in what Trump is proposing is the ripping up of two fundamental principles in the understanding of the West. One is sovereignty, the right of self-determination. In effect, the US has called President Zelensky and said, as if to an American president, hey, we'd like you to give up Maine and Massachusetts, and we're going to ask you to reduce your armed forces by 25% and we are also going to abandon any guarantees of ongoing security cooperation or defense in the event of an act of aggression. And so don't be surprised if Zelensky says, you're taking away two fundamental elements of the West. One is the principle of rule of law and sovereignty, and the other is historic alliances. And you're doing so for the reason Susan says, you have a predilection for Russia, you have a predilection for business over principle. And when as we get towards the end of 2025, Ivo, I think we're going to start looking back at this year and piecing together a version of the world in which Xi Jinping celebrates the 80th anniversary of victory in the Pacific, as if this was something that was done between a group of Asian leaders erasing the history of the West, while President Trump rips up the fundamental principles of the 1945 settlement, which were around sovereignty and alliances, and so in that sense too also erases the idea of the West. And something really profound happens within the context of that 28-point plan.
Got to take a break right here. This is World Review with Ivo Dollar. We'll be back to continue our discussion about Ukraine. Welcome back to World Review. Here with me today are Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, James Harding of The Observer, and Peter Spiegel of The Washington Post. We're talking today about Ukraine and the 28-point peace plan to end the war. James, you were just talking about Steve Witkoff might leave, in which case things would go back to some normal situation in which the United States joins its European allies to deal with Ukraine on the one hand, or the end of the West on the other. That's quite a choice.
I don't think, just to be clear, Ivo, I don't think Steve Witkoff leaves, but as we've seen in the Trump administration, you can become so discredited that you end up being a walk-on part.
So let me put it this way.
Susan's shaking her head.
Yeah, no. So let me put it this way. The choice is between Steve Witkoff riding off into sunshine as a lost soul or the end of the West. And I want to get both Susan and Peter involved in here. I do think there's one part on the West that is really important. This 28-point plan and the security guarantee framework that has now also been released seems to be based on the idea that the United States is not a member of NATO. The security guarantee is going to be provided by the United States and by NATO, as if the two are separate. In fact, it is going to be signed by Russia. Interesting that Russia is going to provide the security guarantee to Ukraine, the United States, the European Union, and NATO. I don't know how NATO signs without the United States being part of that, but that sort of tells you this construct that the NATO is now something that is over there in Europe, and the United States isn't part of it, even though it was, let's think, as the former ambassador to this, U.S. ambassador to this organization, it was a founding member. So, Susan, where do you think this is going? The end of the West or the end of Steve Witkoff?
I'm a little bit at a loss for words. I mean, guys, seriously, because Donald Trump is playing Europe, back and forth and seeing what he can get, this is not on the level. Mark Rutte is not a Donald Trump whisperer. He doesn't understand what's going on. If you think that the White House is going to jettison Steve Witkoff because they've embarrassed Donald Trump, no, that is not. This country is now being run by a guy whose golf partner and business partner with his family is now our chief envoy to a war he knows nothing about, and he doesn't care, and Donald Trump doesn't care. Here's what the 28-point plan is, guys. Here's what the 28-point plan is. It is a combination of Vladimir Putin's talking points and cutting and pasting the 28-point plan for Gaza, okay? Donald Trump, if you read this plan, is going to be the chair of a peace board because that's what he's going to be in Gaza. Neither thing will ever happen, okay? Donald Trump will never be the chair of a peace board that runs and administers the peace that doesn't exist in Gaza, and Donald Trump will never be the chair of a peace board that administers a peace that doesn't happen in Ukraine. And we are all playing into a fantasy here. This is not a serious peace plan.
No, I appreciate that. And that's the reason why I'm saying, on the one hand, it should be the end of Steve Witkoff. I'm just saying, if the United States pursues this because Donald Trump sticks close to his friends, I just want to just give a sense of how that feels in Europe. The Poles will be convinced that in the event of a Russian incursion, the United States will not be there to defend them, right? Across the whole of the Baltics, all the way down through southern Europe, there will be a sense that Europe is not going to be defended by the United States. And in the United Kingdom, the view will be that the quote-unquote special relationship, that Atlantic relationship, is not a guarantee of our security when push comes to shove. And when we start thinking that, you can be sure the Russians will be thinking exactly the same.
So you need to start thinking that already. I'm sorry, but like the only thing that I'm taking issue with is the idea that it will be that way, or that if this plan, is not abandoned, that Europe will be have cause to believe that Trump will not defend them. Trump will not defend them. Okay, guys, that's what I'm trying to say. When the United States had this election result, all of the bad things that you're saying, they already exist, and Europe is in denial that they exist. Okay, that's what I'm saying. And it's really shocking that so many smart people continue to believe that it is a matter of speculation about whether Donald Trump will go to war for Poland if Putin attacks Poland. Because guess what? Donald Trump will not go to war for Poland.
But my point is, Susan, what I can't understand is how people in the United States don't get that once you get to that point, the logical decision is for Europe to play the US and China.
Yes.
The idea that the Europeans are going to toe the line on China is not going to last.
We get that, James. We get that. I think what people don't understand in Washington and in Europe is how serious this is. And the idea that, we can just go from red carpet for Vladimir Putin to being like, Donald Trump has changed his mind. Like, people who amplified that credulously, should really re-examine the credibility of their analysis.
Peter, you have reported from Europe. You were bureau chief of the Financial Times. You're now competitor newspaper, but I'm sure you still have very, very fond memories of it. What you rightly said, Europe should have been Trump-proofing, and they haven't. So, why haven't they? What is it in Europe that, and is it because they didn't understand, or just because they are in denial, or because they're incapable?
Well, it's funny. I mean, I hate to say this, but every Trump policy has a kernel of truism. And the revealing stuff about Vance in particular is that he gets furious that the Europeans has been able to spend on social safety nets and relying on the United States for military support. And this has been a bipartisan thing. This is not just a Trump thing, obviously. I was in Brussels when Robert Gates made his last address as defense secretary. It was in Brussels. He said, you have to realize I am of a generation that was the last to fight shoulder to shoulder with you on this continent in World War II. The next generation forgets. And the Europeans never listened to that warning. And again, this is 10, 15 years ago.
2011, June 2011.
2011, right, 14 years ago. So the extent to which Europe, for financial and political reasons, has refused to spend money on defense, look what's happening in France right now. They can't even raise the retirement age to deal with their pension crisis. The sclerotic nature of most Western European politics right now, particularly when it comes to spending and budgets, there just is no political willingness to spend money on defense. The other thing I just want to throw in here.
Just one small point, right? Just one small point. You're completely right about sclerotic issues in Europe. There are massive problems in terms of growth and the culture of European politics. But it's just important when we talk about defense that in our recent lifetimes, in the past 2 decades, the 2 biggest commitments of European military have been in the service and alongside the US policy in the wake of 9/11, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there'll be people listening who are like, hang on a second, you're saying the Europeans essentially can't muster any spending on defense. Lots of people listening will say, no, Europeans spilt blood and treasure in alliance with the United States on policies that were spearheaded by the United States.
That is fair. That is fair. But before we run out of time, I want to inject one more thing, because I don't think we've talked about this yet, but I think it's very important about why now is different. I do think it takes two to tango, and I think we forget that Zelensky does have agency here. And I think the comparison with Gaza is important because, Susan, you were denigrating the Gaza deal, but let's be honest, the hostages are gone. Most of the high-end fighting is over. You got to give the administration some credit on that front. But it was because they had leverage on both sides, both against the Israelis and against Hamas, and that deal was able to happen. The problem, I think, now in Ukraine, and we haven't mentioned this, is Zelensky is now in the middle of the biggest corruption scandal in the history of his administration. He has lost domestic political support because it is getting very close to some of his closest aides, recordings of kickbacks in the energy sector. Poroshenko, as you mentioned, Susan, has come out and called for his ouster. So Zelensky is now weak at home, and his ability to rally even his European allies may be affected on this one. So I think the other point of why Zelensky is in a very, very difficult position right now is not only because the administration is acting on its initial instincts, but his ability to generate support domestically at home, but also with most European allies, may be fatally damaged because of this corruption scandal that's going on now. That is really, really, for the first time in 7 years of war, undermine his ability to lead there. And I think that's a calculation I suspect the administration has also taken into account.
Well, I think that's right. I think the Donald Trump is a person who smells weakness. And right now he thinks that Zelensky's weak, but he's weak in a different way. He's weak in a way he can't compromise on the most important thing that matters to Ukraine, which is its sovereignty. So this idea, which seems to be infused in the policymaking in the White House, various leaks and officials saying, well, he's weak, we can force him to do this. People don't give up their country just because they happen to be weak. And in fact, to the extent that he is weak and he would be stepping down, he's not going to be replaced by somebody who's going to give Donald Trump the benefit of a Nobel Peace Prize, let alone the kinds of money that is now needs to be compensated for security assistance. Is going to be somebody who's going to be even tougher. So I think this is a total miscalculation. This idea that because Zelensky has this crisis, which is real, and it's a big corruption crisis, it goes to the heart of what matters to people because it's the inability, unwillingness to use money that was used for protecting power and electricity and heating for the winter that was being put into different bank accounts. So it's real. But the idea that he's weak and therefore he's going to do Vance's bidding because the Vance tells him to, I don't think that's going to happen.
I agree with that. But I think we need to factor that into our analysis here. I mean, I think that's why that's why Trump is doing what he's doing, but it's just not going to work.
Well, the other point to make, and I agree with everything you said, Peter, as far as that goes, except that it also underscores the big picture framing here, which is that the United States isn't behaving like an ally and partner of Ukraine. And if you think your partner is weak from a scandal, so you're going to impose the dismemberment of their country on them, then maybe you're not on their side and you're on the other guy's side. And so that's what I'm trying to say. And again, just to make the point, by the way, about Gaza and the 28-point peace plan, I reject the framing, and I think it's one of the ways in which a lot of people have essentially puffed up Donald Trump. I have to say that I think it's this idea, well, you have to give him credit. You have to give him credit. Donald Trump has worked the refs so successfully that journalists here, did you say that same thing when Joe Biden negotiated a ceasefire or multiple ceasefires? No, you did not. You did not. And here's the thing, okay? It is a great thing. We can all agree upon that. Who isn't happy that Donald Trump chose to use his leverage on Netanyahu to force him to make a ceasefire deal and finally get those hostages out, okay? Everybody is happy about that. And Donald Trump had leverage to expend in Israel because he and the Republican Party have so completely owned the political relationship with Israel, right? And, I think it has a lot more to do with a choice that Donald Trump has made both geopolitically and for his own personal interests to ally the United States much more closely with the Gulf Arabs who have pressured him to do this at a time when he is in business and enriching himself and his family for billions of dollars, literally billions of dollars going into the pocket of himself and his family. And I don't think that any of us on this conversation, which is, an important and great conversation, believe that Donald Trump's multi-point plan for the future of Gaza is going to be implemented in any way. At least I certainly am very skeptical about that. And I think that the template that I'm reflecting here is that broader plan for what the future of Ukraine is going to look like. I would also note that Donald Trump, in previous rounds of this Russia-Ukraine thing, had advocated for months for a ceasefire. And then around the period of the Alaska summit said, oh, actually, no, never mind. We're not going to have a ceasefire. We're just going to go right to a long-term peace solution, which he claimed at that meeting was going to happen imminently and be followed up within days by a three-person summit. So again, why is it that when we are constantly talking about you have to give him credit and you have to, say like, well, he's accomplished a lot, here in bringing these people to the table, that no, actually, maybe that's not an accurate statement to present to people.
And Susan, can I just say, so I totally agree with you, Susan. I agree with you both on the broader Israel-Gaza point, the overclaiming on Trump's part. The big difference, of course, was that you had Israel and Hamas with greater interests in forging some kind of ceasefire/peace than in continuing to fight. That's not what you've got in this situation. I would argue from either Putin or Zelensky. Both of them have a strong inclination to keep fighting for their own political reasons. And I'd just make one other point. This goes back. I know you think I'm a little delusional on Steve Witkoff. I'm saying this not that he's going to get defenestrated, not he's going to get kind of chucked out, but that he's going to get exposed for being, this is charitable, a very clumsy diplomat. Because you cannot say, I've got a plan. It involves a constitutional change. It involves a decision by all members of NATO. It involves a decision by the members of the G7 to expand G8. And you know what? Do it by Thursday. That's someone who hasn't worked out how organizations work. They're not going to get that done.
I would go.
It's brilliant. He's already been exposed, is my only point. We're not waiting.
I think we need to push it a little further, because I think Peter's point about the general positive reaction that people have had to the end of the Gaza war and Trump's role in it and the 20-point plan, I do think is important, because it probably influenced Trump's view on how to solve this problem.
This is my point.
And that, the same people, because it's not just Steve Witkoff. Here's the other protagonist who played a role, Jared Kushner. He was part of the discussion. Jared Kushner was part of the discussion when the Ukrainians were informed about this plan a couple of weeks later. And the 28 plan, some of the elements of the 20-point Gaza plan seem to have been just lifted on top of a Russian peace plan, and now it becomes a U.S. plan for Ukraine.
That's exactly why I raised it. That's literally what I already said.
Exactly. And so it's not going to work for all the reasons that you have said. Most importantly, Ukraine has not been defeated. Hamas was defeated. 650 Israeli generals and international security experts said Hamas is defeated. Ukraine's not defeated. They are fighting this war in ways that, frankly, no one else has been able to do, and they're on the attack.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I was very quickly. I mean, the point about the Gaza deal also is those 20-point plan was not a Trump plan, right? This is something that the quartet and Tony Blair had been working on for years, and Tony Blair said, "Hey, I got this." And like, okay, that's my plan now. Whereas the plan that is now being presented to the Ukrainian is a Russian plan that's been pulled out. So they are different things. But the point I was making about the compare and contrast is that Zelensky does have agency here. And this is basically James's point, right? He doesn't have to agree to this. The problem is, unlike the Gaza, that he is incredibly weak in that he is so reliant on American weaponry and has a domestic political situation that's undermining his support. And I think that's an incredibly difficult position for him to be in right now.
This is World Review with Ivo Dollar. We'll be right back to continue our discussion about Ukraine. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder. I'm joined this week by Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, Peter Spiegel of The Washington Post, and James Harding of The Observer. We're talking about the 28-point peace plan from Ukraine. How this plays out in the next few weeks is really going to determine the future of the U.S.-European relationship, the U.S. role in the transatlantic relationship, and indeed the future of Ukraine. We just talked, Peter just mentioned that Ukraine has agency. And of course it does have agency in a way that Hamas probably didn't have agency. The biggest difference between Gaza and Ukraine. The other thing that is important is, unlike Hamas, Ukraine has friends. All of Europe is right behind it. So what are you hearing? What do you think is likely to happen now? Now that the Europeans are confronted with should have been the reality a long time ago that the United States does not share its view with regard to Ukraine, but they're now clearly confronted with this. A sign peace by Christmas, capitulate by Thanksgiving, or no more aid, no more military aid that the Europeans have been paying for, no more intelligence support that has absolutely been critical to Ukraine's ability to defend itself. The Europeans are going to ask, okay, are we going to accept this, or are we going to demonstrate that we have agency? How do you look at it, James?
So I think we are likely to disagree because we disagree. And Susan said something right at the beginning that was really important, and I think has crept up on all of us, which is that Donald Trump has bought a Russian version of this history, which is that Ukraine is not really a country. Ukraine is in the midst of a civil war between some Russian speakers and Ukrainians, and he's bought the Putin line. And the Europeans just don't see it that way. The Europeans think that Ukraine is a sovereign country, that Ukraine, for all its flaws and the point that Peter made about, corruption and the issues in its government, is a sovereign country, much like the countries that it embraced from the former Soviet Union and have joined the European Union. And that historic disagreement, it's historic in two senses, a disagreement about history and a fundamental difference in view between Europe and the United States, I think drives us apart. Because if essentially Trump is going to side with a territorial aggressor over the principles of sovereignty and the alliance is going to say, you have rejected our fundamental principles, we have to make our own way here. I think the first step you'll see is what I was trying to suggest, which is politics on the part of the Europeans, which is to try and win in round. But meanwhile, an attempt to try and release the money that's held in Belgium, the Russian assets held in Belgium. That money depends how you count it, 120, 240 billion. It's a fair sum of money that you could then start applying to Ukrainian defense. I think that's the first step, but it's one that would obviously infuriate Moscow and will also call out which side is Washington on.
James, can I ask you just to take it a step further, though? Because obviously the UK in particular, it's been interesting to watch, particularly with the Labour government in. You've had a real division over Israel where Lamy, when he was foreign secretary, refused to give weaponry to the Israelis, breaking with the U.S. You've now had this incident where in Venezuela, where the UK has decided to stop sharing intelligence through the Five Eyes program, which is at the end of Five Eyes. And now what clearly is going to be a break over Ukraine. And I guess the UK being, the special relationship is perhaps the one in the focus, but clearly this is happening Europe-wide. The problem is, again, I was in Brussels about 4 or 6 weeks ago, something like that. I kept raising this issue, and the problem is everyone kept coming back to me saying, but we need the U.S. We need the U.S. And there doesn't seem to be this is a point of principle, and therefore next. And that's the thing I'm trying to struggle with. I don't know if you have a view on how this manifests itself in Europe, given that there has now become a fundamental split about how the U.S. and Europe sees the world.
Well, two things, Peter. I think, one, I keep coming back to Poland. Poland has a very deep emotional place in the history of Europe. It has also, obviously, deep relation in particular states in the United States. But Poland is going to watch this and feel deeply vulnerable. And the call on Europe and the neighbors in Europe to consider the future defense of Poland, right, is going to be critical in this. Right? So I think that then raises a second point, which is, yes, historically we have needed the United States technologically, economically. But in the end, if it's not there for your security, that calculation changes. And I think we're at one of those moments, sadly, like Syria in 2013, where the world changes and the understanding of what commitments are to other people changes. And the consequence of those catch up with us in a very profound way, but over years, not over weeks.
Do you see that happening already? I mean, just one last thing in this, because you have Starmer is incredibly weak right now. Macron is incredibly weak right now. Merz also is underwater in the polls. I mean, all the big political leaders in Europe are also now struggling domestically. Do you see any effort by Europe to get its act together in the near future? Or you said over years this happened.
So I think you could be facing something much more profound, which is the European economies as well are really fragile. They don't have the growth. There's this sense that there's blood in the water in the debt markets. What happens if you have a financial crisis or one or more European countries? Are we going to be propelled into something quite likely a post-Macron, much more right-wing government in France? As you say in the UK, that's a real possibility here too. You put all that together, you see essentially a fundamental change over time in our politics, right? But it won't just be domestic. It just won't be just domestic. And that's what I think is for the United States is a bigger risk than I think is being appreciated, because when you lose your allies and friends, you end up with a global politics that's much more transactional and flimsier as a result.
Susan, how is this going to play out in the United States? Because it is absolutely true that Donald Trump's view of alliances is not what any of his predecessors' view has been. I think that's becoming clearer and clearer. You and I have been saying this for a long time. The Europeans are slower to admit, in part because of the dependence that exists. But there are plenty of people in the United States who believe that the alliance is crucial. There are plenty of people in the United States who believe that Ukraine and the support of Ukraine and the independence of Ukraine and the defeat of Russia is important. If you do a blind vote in Congress, it'd probably be somewhere around 515 to 20. And the 20 would be abstentions rather than maybe I'm wrong, but something. It'd be overwhelming, including among Republicans. Where's the pushback going to be in the United States, particularly if the Europeans say, okay, we get it. We are really, really get it. We need to do this alone. By the way, they have agency not only on the issue of Ukraine, they have agency on other things like China. The Dutch might say, oh, ASML wants to sell their photo optic machines to build advanced chips to China. Well, we're going to do that because we're not going to listen to the United States about this. So how does this play in the United States?
Donald Trump has a consistent predilection for adversaries over allies. He met this week in the Oval Office with the young Prince of Saudi Arabia, lavished him with praise, threatened in really gross terms an American reporter who had the temerity to ask about why it is that we should be welcoming with such open arms a man who literally signed off on the gruesome murder of a Washington Post columnist with a bone saw. Okay, this is the world that we're in, and again, that's, forgive me for my frustration, but who comes to dinner that night? The tycoons of the American technology elite, whose money comes from all of us. Again, Peter can't say it. The owner of the Washington Post is, joining in on this. So the United States is pivoting to.
Well, in fairness, he wasn't there.
He has joined in with the Trump administration on many, many things, and seems to be perfectly willing to go along with a radical pivot. That's the point I was trying to make. Seems to be willing to go along with a radical pivot in America's geopolitical positioning and its national security strategy. And I think, it'll be interesting to see when you reconvene this group, Eva, when the new national security strategy of the United States comes out, as it is supposed to do soon. And it is going to say that the United States is no longer essentially a pillar of the West. And to James' point, it's going to ratify that. It's going to say in terms that are going to cause Europe to really freak out that essentially the United States now has a great power, spheres of influence, foreign policy, that the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence. It is the domain with which we are most concerned. And the other pillar of our national security strategy is to literally wage war upon the enemies within this country. And that is going to be written in black and white. And I want to say that that's the context in which, of course, this is occurring with Europe, with our allies and partners in Asia. And on some level, it's such a big disruption, right, that it's actually hard to unpack it down at the level in which we all exist and we need to exist of day in and day out. Well, here's what this negotiation says. Here's what this plan says. And so, forgive me because I understand it's at a high level, but I've seen Trump and the Pentagon move here with much more speed and rapidity than I think any of us could have reasonably expected 9 months ago to turn this from inflammatory rhetoric that might upset European leaders in a tweet to an actual reality. And so, again, for me, that's the context in which we should see Russia, Ukraine, as well as what's happening with China. It is a profound and very radically different view of what constitutes American national security that we're seeing. A world in which, in fact, the Saudi prince is more important than Ursula von der Leyen.
James, I don't know if you want to jump in there. If I can just say something very quickly, though. I think, again, maybe I'm the guy just going to keep bringing up domestic political situations. This is a different Donald Trump right today than he was 6 months ago, right? The Democrats won the election in first week of November. There are divisions within the MAGA movement right now over, God, pick your poison, anti-Semitism, Jeffrey Epstein. This is a very weakened president. So I think, to Ivo's point, that there are other voices in the American foreign policy that may now feel a bit more room to raise those voices. And I think we would not have seen that 6 months ago when we thought everything that Trump did was the word of God, particularly in the Republican Party. There are fights over this, and his domestic position is much weaker, and I suspect we are going to see those voices be heard over the next 24 or 48 hours.
So I would, before James, I'm bringing you in, just on this point, I think those voices are more likely to come forward because I do agree that the relative balance of political power in the United States is shifting, though maybe not as much as you think. But I do think that particularly on Capitol Hill, people are going to come forward to say things in a way that they haven't been willing to do so. Whether that will have any influence on Trump's policy with regard to supporting Ukraine or not, I have sincere doubts. Congress cannot mandate providing intelligence support to Ukraine. And if the U.S. wants to withdraw, he just withdraws it. And I think that's part of the problem. But James,
I just wanted your listeners, Ivo, to get to hear the scoundrels of journalism at work, because I wanted to pick Susan's pocket. But can you say a bit more about the national security strategy and who's actually writing it, when you think it comes out? Because I think what you just said is exactly true. That is going to absolutely put the cat among the pigeons in Europe.
Yeah, so I mean, it's mandated that they're supposed to do this. There have been initial news reporting by lots of smart plugged in people who have said that the initial drafts, in fact, were so inflammatory that, they had to go back to the drawing board, that they were, sounds like, from what I've read, like ChatGPT's version of, America First, manifest destiny, great power kind of slogan. So I don't know exactly, James. Probably Peter and his great reporters have a better visibility on it. Just quickly, on the question of whether Donald Trump is weakened politically in a way that significantly affects his foreign policy. Donald Trump, in the same way that I think Ivo's point is very well taken, that a weakened Zelensky may have less running room to accept negotiations on fundamental points rather than more running room. I think that the prospect of a weakened Donald Trump, and I definitely agree he's weakened if you look at his poll numbers, right now. And then, by the way, the two things that I think really matter are the poll numbers, which have sunk into their lowest level of either presidency, and his economic situation, which is very precarious. But on foreign policy is where American presidents have the biggest and most unchecked hand, first of all. Second of all, Trump in a corner, his default move is always to escalate rather than to de-escalate, to escalate and distract. So in fact, you should anticipate more wild and disruptive moves, a la, the gunboat diplomacy in the Caribbean right now. And then third point, which I think, again, is very important, Congress has never done a single thing in 9 months to assert its basic existence as a separate and independent branch of our government.
We've got to leave it there. I want to thank Susan Glasser of The New Yorker, James Harding of The Observer, Peter Spiegel of The Washington Post. World Review of Ivo Dollar is a Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs podcast from Harvard's Kennedy School. This week's episode was produced by Tectonic Video with engineering assistance from Dave Miska and production assistance from WBEZ in Chicago. This is World Review. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Have a great week, everyone.